while you were doing your research, and you've been doing it for a really long time, did you like finally like crack the story or multiple stories that you wanted to tell and go, I've got a movie here?
Well, so, you know, I mean, I'm not sure if you ever feel, you know, entirely confident you have a movie here, so to speak. It's always this process of exploration and experimentation, and on this one more than any that I've done, where it just, you know, I think early on what did become clear to me was that what sort of interested me in the period, and therefore in the idea of the movie itself, was this idea of kind of maximalism, this idea of that the spirit of the time, the sort of early days of Hollywood, was so infused with a certain kind of fervor, you know, and a certain kind of like this fever dream sort of energy that I wanted the form of the film to kind of reflect that, you know, at least at the outset. So it made sense for it to be an ensemble movie, not just one character, but sort of use a gallery of characters. It made sense to have parties and those kind of set pieces be a big part of the language of the movie. You know, the musical style, the visual style, all of it, you know, just to try to kind of reflect that sort of energy. And then I guess what became interesting too was sort of, you know, at what point does that party energy stop? You know, at what point does the plug get pulled, so to speak? And then it becomes really interesting on a dramatic level to just see, you know, where the chips fall and how people cope or don't. So so I guess those things were all at the outset, and you know, it became about, yeah, I guess sort of isolating the specific people who I felt would kind of convey that bigger story of a society changing the most effective way. And, you know, yeah, that just came from sort of lots of, you know, combo of old Hollywood stories I sort of knew, and then just reading new stuff, stumbling on new stuff, people who were kind of on the margins, for instance, of the industry. So I already knew a lot about the sort of John Gilberts and Clara Bowes, you know, the people, for instance, who sort of informed Brad and Margot's characters, these, you know, kind of movies, that sort of prototype of the movie star at the time who did not, for whatever reason, cope with sound. But a lot of the people who were more, again, on the periphery of the industry and had this sort of more fleeting moment of sort of centrality, and either due to the transition or due to something else peripheral to it, people like Giovanni Depo's character, some of the jazz musicians of that era, kind of got sucked into the vortex of Hollywood when sound came in. You know, Anna May Wong, people like that, who sort of informed Lady Fei Zhu's character. So, you know, Manny's character was sort of based on a lot of kind of, you know, sort of shards and bits and pieces of stories, because none of them were that famous ultimately, but bits and pieces of stories about people who kind of, you know, would rise up the ranks very quickly from a place of totally outside the industry, you know, not just sort of bottom of the rung in terms of the types of jobs they were doing, but, you know, even outside of any specter of polite society in Los Angeles at that time. You know, for instance, the Mexican immigrant community there, a lot of whom were coming in during the Mexican Revolution, and so you have this sort of burgeoning community in the 20s, a lot of whom wound up getting sort of bit jobs and bit parts in Hollywood, in the sort of burgeoning industry of the time. And a few of whom were able to rise the ranks and even have these kind of moments, again, usually fleeting, but moments of power or moments of a real foot in the door. So it was a mix of all those things, of sort of some certain stories I already knew, certain stories that were totally new to me, and then trying to kind of, you know, hone them down, knowing the bigger story I wanted to tell.
You know, when you're watching Babylon, and definitely when you're also watching La La Land, it is clear that Singing in the Rain struck a massive chord. What is it, or what was it about that film that, when did that chord really get struck? Like, when did you watch that movie and go, oh my God, like get that inspiration where it's clearly been a huge part of two of your films?
Well, I thought I mean, so the movie itself I've loved forever. Actually, I shouldn't say that forever, because I used to hate musicals.
You would never know that.
I know. It was sort of a, you know, I compensated in a way. I wound up falling in love so hard, almost to compensate for the fact. So as soon as that love affair began, Singing in the Rain, of course, you know, sort of was front and center. But I think, you know, then just being interested in the making of some of those classic old Hollywood musicals, just by my interest in the genre, reading about the making of Singing in the Rain, I became even more fascinated by that, because there was this whole backstory to Singing in the Rain that that wasn't as familiar to me. You know, for instance, the fact that none of the songs in Singing in the Rain, except for one exception, were written for the film initially. They were all pre-existing hit songs, most of them from the 20s. And in fact, the way Sing in the Rain came about as a movie was that Arthur Freed, who was running the sort of a unit of musicals at MGM at the time in the 50s, he had this, he was kind of looking for a new movie idea. He was a producer. He had this back catalog of songs that he and some colleagues had written back in the 20s that felt like, he should use them for a musical. So it was exactly the same thing as if, someone gives you a stash of songs, that you happen to have the rights to. It gives you like, like the Queen catalog or the Beatles catalog or something, and says, figure out a story for this. So Arthur Freed, sat with some writers and tried to figure out what's a story that could link all these songs together. And because they were all from this period, the period of this movie, it quickly sort of dawned on him, why don't we just tell a story about what was going on in Hollywood during that time, and what the first context for a lot of these songs were. And so, that little nugget in the middle of the movie when Singing in the Rain, that was the first time that Singing in the Rain was actually put on film. It wasn't Gene Kelly. It was in 1929, one of the first musical numbers Hollywood ever attempted. This kind of very weird, you can find it, those of you who haven't seen it, you can find it on YouTube. I would say it's just as weird and garish as what we present on screen. It's a lineup of all of MGM's biggest stars at the time, lined up on bleachers in front of a giant backdrop of Noah's Ark with these weird rain slickers on and these kind of grinning faces with too much makeup and rain pouring, and they're sort of dancing and singing. That was the screen introduction of Singing in the Rain. The kind of going backwards from a movie made in the 50s that I loved so much, and sort of finding a little bit kind of where the germs of it were. And then you start to kind of figure out, well, who were these people based on? Who was Jean Hagen's character, with the crazy, very famously grating voice? Who was she based on? Who was Gene Kelly's character based on? Where did the whole I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you thing that Gene Kelly does in the movie, where'd that come from? All the little stories and jokes in Sing the Rain came from real things. And so it felt like maybe kind of trying to hew, on the one hand, a little closer to the reality where those things happen, yet on the other hand, this is also a fictional film, so trying to kind of take my own liberties with it. But I would say going in sort of the opposite direction so that they could be kind of cousins to each other in a weird way. Sing the Rain, of course, is a much more optimistic, rosy version of that transition. I felt like there was a lot of dirt under the fingernails, a lot of grime that had been swept under the rug that was worth unpacking and bringing out to light. So that was sort of what drove me.
When I was watching the film for the first time, and I saw it 3 times, FYI. So I did not know that Singing in the Rain was performed back then. I thought it was performed for the first time for the Gene Kelly movie. But it got me thinking about all the research that you did to capture that time, because just a lot of people I spoke to after many of the screenings were like, wow, was Hollywood really like that in the 20s? I thought cocaine was an 80s thing, not a 20s thing. But it was, I guess. That must have been just such a big revelation for you during all that. But what were some of the bigger wow moments that you discovered while you were doing your dissertation with your research?
Well, I don't know if I can call that I guess just to jump off what you're saying, the level to which drug use, for instance, was so, I would say not just prevalent in Hollywood at the time, but kind of at the DNA of it. It was so, I think it accounts in some ways for some of that sort of crazed energy that was in the air. It's also a weird time if you look at kind of the history of drug use in America. The 20s are an interesting time because, depending on where you are in the country and when in the 20s you are, a lot of these drugs we now think of as hard drugs are much more legal than alcohol, and so cocaine was everywhere, but it wasn't really necessarily the way we think of cocaine today, or the way you thought of in the 70s or 80s. It was just a little different. They would even kind of flagrantly, there was a whole genre, a whole subset of kind of Max Sennett adjacent silent comedies in the teens going into the early 20s with people like Fatty Arbuckle and whatnot. that they literally just called cokey comedies, and those you can find online too, and you'll kind of be shocked that they were made back then, because it's all characters running around who are clearly on cocaine, and they're called cokey comedies, and they're just, but then you remember, like, it's like, actually, there was a fleeting moment before it was all illegalized where it actually almost felt normal. Heroin went through a similar kind of journey as well. So that was one thing that was really interesting. I think the other thing was also just how much and rapidly Hollywood changed in such a short span of time. I think that, we often think of history as taking a long time. Things all sort of happen slowly, and so you think of a town like Los Angeles taking its modern shape over a long course of time. But one of the unique things about LA and about Hollywood, by extension, was how abrupt this shift initially was, such that really within the span of, we tried to gesture to it in the movie, within the span of, certainly 10 years, but I'd say even less, even within that, maybe 6 years, you can really feel in your gut, I think, just looking at the photographs and whatnot, a mostly rural, sort of dusty cow town morphing into one of the world's great cities. Yeah. And then with the concurrent change happening within that of a sort of ragtag, almost circus feeling kind of group of people making this new thing called movies, this very vulgar art form that's not considered a true art, by high society, that's sort of somewhere below vaudeville, in terms of the echelon of things. That sort of circus-like atmosphere morphing into this absolute behemoth, into one of America's biggest exports, into one of the world's biggest businesses, into, and the kind of the corporate Hollywood we think of today, And so just how that transition happens so fast. And of course, whenever you have transitions happening that fast, sometimes they're brought about by wars, sometimes, but in this case, it wasn't that. It was just this weird influx, sort of weird cross-section of circumstances. When things happen that fast, there's always going to be collateral damage. There's going to be, the sort of gleaming new emblems of progress and achievements that we can all sort of feel proud about. And then there's going to be a lot of, basically corpses, for lack of a better word, sort of strewn in the wake. And so, that, I knew there was rich terrain there to mine and to sort of, try to be holistic about.
In terms of that rich terrain, so there's the midpoint of the film there is when Manny was seeing a crowd reacting to a jazz singer. And he runs out, he gets on the phone, everything's changing. And then the very next scene, I love the way you turn on this light, turn on that light, like it's really poetic. But that transition that you're talking about, the way things change so fast, is that you have one moment, you have all these different things that are filming at the same time. It doesn't matter, it's silent. You're not going to hear what's going on over there. We can film something over here. And then, poor Nellie, she has to say hello college 8 times. And each time it's like she misses her mark, or there's sound was low, or somebody's shoes were not rubber soles. Like you just see, like, holy shit, like everything is changing. Like, no, we can't do anything the way we did it before.
Yeah, the wheels fall off the wagon a little bit. Yeah.
So when it came to filming the Hello College sequence, how did you stage that, and how much of all that change did you made it into the film, and how much didn't make it into the film?
Oh, I mean, yeah, most of that's in the film, partly because it was, in a way, unlike a lot of the rest of the film. It was very intentionally, sort of kind of timed out and planned to within a T of itself. It's almost, I almost wanted it to have a kind of schematic lifelessness to it, because that's sort of what, so the camera, a camera that's been just unmoored before then and just, doing figure eights all over the place is pretty much static in that scene. I mean, of course it goes handheld a little bit by the end, but mostly the camera doesn't move at all, or just moves with a person, the cutting patterns become really repetitive, intentionally so. So it was kind of like trying to lean into all the things that would represent the polar opposite of the kind of language and style that the movie had sort of had in the first half. But I guess all of it, again, it just comes back to trying to capture the spirit, of that time as I interpreted it. There were certain things that, were just so ironic in a way, given that sound was supposed to be this technological advance for film, but how much regression it sort of brought with it. You know, that movies that went from total freedom, you know, I mean, by the end of the silent era, they're doing everything with the camera that they do today. You know, they're doing handheld, they're doing multiple cameras, they're doing obviously very mobile, you know, sort of incredible. You think of some of Murnau's crane shots, I mean, just incredible movement, and crazy experimentation, and you know, Abel Gance is doing three like almost predicting Cinerama decades before the fact. They have 3D. Or you know, a certain version of 3D before the fact. They're tinting films. They have, you know, early Technicolor processes. Anyway, they have so much stuff that you would think of as coming much later at that end of the silent era, and then sound comes in and boom, just undercuts all of that. Suddenly it's just about, okay, we have to just figure out how to make this image that will allow the sound to marry to it, and so we haven't yet figured out, you know, quite how to rejigger everything. For instance, we haven't quite figured out yet in those first couple of years how to edit sound. So the sound you get on set is the sound you're going to be stuck with. So you better not sneeze or, you know, miss your mark or something. You know, we can't hear we don't want to hear a camera rolling during that time. So the camera's got to be put inside a box, much to the chagrin of the DPs having to operate it. You know, you can't have air flowing through the, you know, we got to be locked on a sound stage. Everyone's got to be quiet. Again, the greatest irony of all, that sound coming in meant suddenly you started seeing something that you never saw in the silent era: silence please signs. You know, the idea of a sound stage. Why is it called a sound stage? It's, you know, these things were, you know, they sometimes, it's not that they'd never shot silent films on stages or inside, but the entire approach changed. The red light, the, you know, the no windows. I mean, it was just a much more open air approach before that then just got really hermetic and kind of sealed. Eventually, of course, you know, you jump ahead in time and they figured out a lot of these kinks. They figured out the boom mic, and they figured out how to make less noisy cameras, less noisy lights, etc. But man, I shudder to think that what that first year, you know, first year or two must have been like for filmmakers who just weeks before, you know, were shooting out with, you know, camera on horse cars and out in the, you know, out in the fields with, you know, thousands of extras. I mean, it just must have been, yeah.
It was a breeze compared to what the problems.
I can understand that, yeah, that sense of an immediate loss that they must have felt, you know, even while being conscious that maybe the art form is moving forward in some fundamental way. Man, we've lost something that that will, you know, that you had to think at that time we'll never get back. You know,
when you're going from Whiplash to La La Land to First Man, and with the way that the bar is raised with each film that you make, I mean, the bar just like went through the roof filming Babylon. At what point did you sort of like feel maybe, I don't know, daunted, you know, or
yeah,
overwhelmed?
All the time. Yeah. Definitely all the time. I think I speak for everyone involved in the movie. We all, you know, I think part of the problem was that because it wanted to be sort of this panoramic portrait of a society, it's easy to say all these things and kind of it's easy to write them down on paper to a certain extent, but to actually sort of execute them with, you know, when you have a certain box, you know, you have your budget, and you know you can't go outside of that, and you don't have as much time as you want, you don't have as many resources as you want, but you know that you have this kind of privileged chance to do this, so you're not going to complain, you're just going to figure out a way to make it happen. Yeah. You know, but it comes down to simple things, like, for instance, trying to recreate the feeling of shooting a battle scene at the height of the silent era, when it would be routine for them to have thousands upon thousands of, you know, warriors in the field. Obviously we couldn't have that, you know, so it's, you try to, in some ways the camera style of the film was dictated by that as well. It was trying to always make it feel like there was more stuff extending past the edges of the frame, so you never quite feel that, I mean, when in reality, really, we were just taking every living soul, you know, that we could, and like putting them right there in the frame, and there's nothing on left and right, you know. Every piece of decor we had, you know, but you try to make it seem like it's kind of grabbed at random, that it's sort of, that there really is this 360, you know, kind of reality that the camera happens to be gliding through. And but all of that, it's one big charade, you know, and figuring out how to stage that kind of a charade, you know, it takes planning, it takes a great group of collaborators who I was lucky to have, incredible DP, production designer, costume designer, whatnot. So, you know, but yeah, that's the real challenge of it, is to make less feel like more.
So when we see Jack and Nellie sort of meet their end, you know, with Jack it's very dramatic, but with Nellie, like this scene really is, I find it very haunting. The way Manny goes into the building and Nellie gets out of the car and she literally just disappears into the night, and the camera holds onto the night, like she literally disappears. This is why I got to do the deep dive with you. What was behind that moment, like filming that moment? Like, what made you go, okay, well, we see what happens to Jack, we don't really see what happens to Nellie? Like, what was behind, like, this is how I want to shoot her last moment?
That was in the script. I have a hard time remembering exactly kind of where that sort of, you know, yeah, how it sort of found itself. I know the basic idea of it was just that, you know, when I made that sort of reference just earlier to this idea of, you know, a movie about a kind of party energy, party atmosphere that then ends. You know, the plug gets pulled, the lights get shown on, the party's over, everyone, you got to go home now. Some people can adapt to that. Some people can collect their things and go, got it, okay, and, you know, go home. And other people just cannot. That as soon as you sort of tell them the party's over, it's like telling them they're dead. That there's just this need inside them to keep it going. So I think early on it felt appropriate for someone like Nellie, that literally the last thing we saw of her would just be her, you know, basically keeping the party alive in her head. You know, so just humming. You know, kind of in her own mind, dancing, but there's no music anymore. And, you know, the music kind of fades away as she fades away. So it's, you know, in my mind, she kind of, it's like this, you know, Pied Piper without anyone to lead. She's gonna, you know, carry that music off with her into oblivion. But it's also one of those characters, I think, where when you're close to them, you can be intoxicated, you can be swept up in there. They're so charismatic and so that you do want to dance with them. They'll convince you actually that it is a party, even when rationally you know that no good can come from this. But you get some distance, and yeah, it can be as simple as just, you know, someone clearly out of their mind, just, you know, in a derelict alley, fading off into blackness, and soon all you can hear is the hum of the lights. So I think trying to, you know, give her some poetry at the end, but also trying to be honest about the kind of the uglier reality of, you know, that this is someone who ultimately is lost in every sense of the word. Last question is literally at the last moment of the film, as Manny is watching Singing in the Rain, he's also having this like a clairvoyant vision into the future of what Hollywood will turn into. The way it started with the sound, going into Raiders of the Lost Ark and Tron and Avatar and all this other stuff. What was behind, like, the movies that you chose for that last moment with Manny when he's having this, like, vision? It was a lot of it was kind of instinctive. That, you know, that there was just a basic kind of basic logic to it that I tried not to overthink, because it did feel like something where logic could kind of kill it, or at least what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to ultimately just be something guttural and something that you couldn't really maybe reduce into words too much, but the logic of it was, you know, just sort of this idea of Hollywood movies in general, let's say, being, you know, dying and being reborn over and over and over again. That, you know, that's in some ways sort of my theory of cinema. That it's, you know, every decade we're told cinema is at its last gasp, cinema is dying, or is already dead, or something. You know. We always think it's the first time that cinema's dying, but those headlines have been written since the silent era. And so I think that, and the thing is, it's not that they're completely wrong, because you can argue that every time someone is saying cinema is dying, maybe a certain kind of cinema is dying. Silent cinema did die. Yeah. You know, certain kinds of cinema, you can argue, do die, but something else gets reborn in the ashes. And so that idea of just, you know, that it's, you know, it's, death and rebirth, whatever that might mean to, you know, we all have different interpretations of that, but that was kind of, for me, the guiding sort of guideline of what kinds of movies to choose, what kinds of movies not to. Beyond that, again, I would say it was instinctive. It was sort of, I had the track of music to play with, and you know, you just kind of get a sense in the edit of just what images are going to respond to each other, what aren't, you know. It becomes as simple sometimes as just, you know, juxtaposing color in black and white, or you know, a diagonal with right angles, or you know, circles with squares. I mean, it can become very sort of graphic like that. So I sort of had the parameters that I knew I wanted to kind of operate within. But ultimately, when you're actually kind of getting into throwing the images on, sometimes it does feel like that. It feels very spontaneous and instinctive, because you kind of, I feel that with this kind of, that kind of sequence where you don't have dialogue, you don't have sort of character even really at that moment, it becomes much more abstract and formal. It'll tell you right away if something is not working. You know, it's sort of like the body rejecting, an organ or something. You know, it'll kind of speak to you right away and tell you, oh, that's working, that's not working. It'll accept certain things, not others.
Well, no matter what happens, what's in the way it has been died, been reborn, the way it is evolved and transformed, what matters on that screen, people care. People care about what happens up on that screen. I'm trying to paraphrase what Brad Pitt said at one point in the movie. But ladies and gentlemen, please keep cinema alive, and make sure you spread the word about Babylon. So, and how do you do that? I mean, you go on social media, so go on Twitter, well, maybe don't Twitter. But, you know, Instagram, Facebook, you know, TikTok. In the back, if you're still using MySpace, that's totally fine. But please spread the word about Babylon, and trust me, see it again, because it's really going to blow your mind. If it didn't already on your first viewing, just wait till you see it again. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you guys so much.